In the now quite distant past, I've made videos about different officer roles in the British Army during the late 18th century, as well as their organization within the regimental system. Well, I'm finally revisiting that series, and in this video, I'd like to discuss the different roles and responsibilities of non-commissioned officers. Now, the research for this video is going to be mainly grounded in the American War of Independence, but the principles that I introduce here are going to be more or less applicable to the entire Georgian era. Now, you don't need to have seen the other videos in this series to understand this one, but they'll definitely help to fill out the complete picture of what I'm describing here. So if this topic is of any interest to you, well, those videos are going to be linked down below in a playlist for you to watch next. We'll take today's topic in 4 main parts. First, covering some of the broader principles behind all the NCO ranks, and then going into the more specific details for each of the kind of sort of 3, 2.5, I don't know, for all of the major roles that I'm going to talk about in 3 parts, in the course of which I'm going to be primarily drawing from 2 main primary sources. The Military Instructor for the Non-Commissioned Officers and Private Men of the Infantry by Thomas Symes, and of course the classic, the Complete Interior Economy of a Battalion of Infantry by Bennett Cuthbertson. Both books were published in 1779, basically as books of recommendations for how to best manage a military organization. Now, if you'd like to look through these books yourself, you'll find them both posted free of charge when you visit my website, nativeoak.org, right alongside a whole slew of other primary sources in the digital library. For Symes, you'll find all this information in the sections labeled "Of the Duty and Conduct of blank," being the respective ranks that are being discussed in the section, while for Cuthbertson, it's all going to be in chapters 2, 3, and 5. Now, it's important to note that these books aren't absolute descriptions of what life in the British Army was like in those days. Rather, they were prescriptions for how these individuals thought things ought to be in the perfect system. The 18th century saw a massive variation in regulations and management styles from regiment to regiment, and some of them were much better handled than others. So take this video as a very, very broad set of best practices, the ideal, rather than a literal description of how everything was always being run. As with every video on my channel, this should represent the start of your research and introduction, not the end. After all, we don't always have an industrious sergeant to lead us through our exercise and teach us the obligations of a soldier, or, for that matter, to lead us through our careers. Workplaces can be rife with pitfalls and stagnation. After all, we all know that one lieutenant who's been languishing for years without the money or favor to purchase his captaincy. And should you have aspirations beyond your stature and present rank, well, at times a little extra help can go a long way towards establishing professional habits and finding better opportunities. Enter this video's sponsor, Strawberry.me, and their action-oriented, results-driven career coaching services. They enable you to take control over your career path like never before by providing professional career coaches who are specially tailored to your individual goals. When you become a member, you'll work with your personal career coach to structure a customized plan to meet your objectives and meet with them regularly to evaluate how things are going, plan your next steps, and to find possible growth opportunities that you may have otherwise missed. This can range from helping to combat burnout, which as a YouTube creator I am thoroughly able to relate to breaking down larger tasks and effectively scheduling out your time. Something else that I know a fair bit about, as I am trying to write a book alongside getting all of these videos out this month. And of course, your coach can help you to figure out exactly what you need to do to advance your career materially. For someone like myself who is self-employed, having this kind of external guidance and accountability can be especially important because otherwise, well, it's not like I have a boss that I need to answer to every morning, and so it's, the buck stops with me. Having someone external can be really helpful in that kind of situation. So, rather than just going through the motions and hoping that good things will happen to you along the way, it's better to establish a solid foundation and a plan for the future. Get matched with your custom career coach today by visiting strawberry.me/BransonF. You'll even get a $50 credit towards your membership. Thank you to strawberry.me for sponsoring this video. And now, let's return to the topic at hand. In our first part, we'll discuss the general role and necessary qualifications for good NCOs, whatever their rank, which are really much the same today as they were in the 18th century, especially in the British tradition, wherein a regiment might be led, directed by the officer class, but on the ground, it's really being run by the NCOs. They're going to be handling all the day-to-day activities and management of the men, be it at the squad of inspection, company, or even regimental level. To put it simply, a battalion might not advance too terribly far without its officers, but it wouldn't even exist without its NCOs. Not only would they be handling the men's discipline, they'd also be responsible for training them, making sure they were equipped and uniformed properly for the tasks at hand. They'd actually be designating those tasks and overseeing their being enacted, and of course, most important of all, they would be handling all of the regimental books and returns, as we'll discuss later on. For these purposes and many others, then, Cuthbertson stressed that good sergeants and corporals were essential to the support of discipline and order in a regiment. As such, men should only ever be selected for those purposes, not by virtue of their appearances and what would look best on parade, as was very common in the 18th century, but through their honesty and sobriety, their being experts at their drill, and more so in being able to teach that drill to others. A qualified NCO should be able to read and write, possessing a quickness of understanding above the common run of soldiers. They were to hold themselves somewhat apart from the rest of the men, never to drink or mess with them, and to be housed separately. Most important of all, to never help the men avoid their officers, or as he and Symes really both enjoy putting it, to help the privates connive at their faults. This was all to reinforce their importance and their authority, and should such airs ever be broken, the NCO offending ought to be immediately sent back to the ranks, where evidently he so desires to be spending his time. Even the officers ought to give them due respect for that reason, and never censure or rudely reprimand them in front of the privates. For while the NCOs were absolutely beneath the officers, existing to enforce the officers' will, still, it was of the utmost importance that every soldier be taught to conceive for his sergeant and corporal the highest possible respect. It's worth noting that much like today, while officers typically start off as officers, NCOs all start off as common privates. They are to rise through meritorious service, and Cuthbertson stresses that young soldiers, and those not long in a given regiment, ought not be considered for such roles. For speedy promotion often puffs up and spoils many who, by continuing a few years longer as a private, might have made a figure. And besides, veteran soldiers, he writes, might have a harder time considering younger, less experienced men as their superiors. Nor should any man become an NCO outright, but always be given a probationary period of 3 months' time to make sure that he is fit for the job. Now, it's also important to note that while the modern Army might have a very wide range of NCO ranks that are all official titles on the books with, different pay grades and responsibilities and the like, things were much simpler during the 18th century when there were really only 2 official ranks. You have sergeants and you have corporals. For example, Sergeant Major wasn't actually an official title so much as a colloquial, informal role until the very end of the 18th century, and we'll discuss them more later on. But the same thing with lance corporals and also lance sergeants. Really, according to Cuthbertson at least, those titles are only ever given to the temporary trial period NCOs to reflect their impermanent status. So if a regular full sergeant is going to be away from his usual duties for some time, then the most deserving corporal would be appointed to act as lance sergeant in his stead, both filling the gap and testing out how he might do in the job. Likewise, if a corporal is away, then the most capable private man can be temporarily assigned as a lance corporal. And that's different from what it is today, where a lance corporal is obviously still beneath a full corporal. It's an official position in its own right, and it's given a specific degree of responsibilities on an official Army level, rather than just whatever the company officers happen to think is appropriate at the time. You know, you don't get a promotion to Lance Corporal so much as you are, you know, given the job of Lance Corporal to see if you're fit for the promotion. The number of NCOs per company and regiment would then vary based on their size, preferably equaling out to the number of squads of inspection, which would each be under one of their direct purviews. For example, at the start of the American War of Independence, a common company of battalion men would have 3 sergeants and 3 corporals, with the company itself being thus divided into 6 squads of inspection. At least on paper, of course, because the companies were very rarely at their full strength. And if any of those terms, again, are strange to you, like I said earlier, I've already got videos where I go over all of that, and you can watch those ones later on. In particular, note that squad of inspection is a purely administrative unit, and it doesn't really correlate to the modern concept of an infantry squad. You know, we don't have a situation where a corporal is, you know, like leading a team of 8 men to, you know, move independently on the field. The platoon is really the smallest possible level of combat organization. But again, that's a topic for another day. So now we'll move on to our second part and discuss the specific roles of corporals during this time period. The 1778 Military Dictionary defines a corporal as being an inferior officer, aka a non-commissioned officer, of foot under a sergeant who has charge of one of the divisions of a company, i.e. a squad of inspection, and who is responsible for placing and relieving sentries. Symes describes the qualifications necessary for a corporal effectively the same way that Cuthbertson does, saying he ought to be honest, sober, and diligent, well skilled in the use of the firelock and ability to teach it, his arms and accoutrements to be kept in such a state of perfection as ever to be desirous of showing them, a neatness in his dress, and a quickness in comprehension with the knowledge of reading, writing, and accounts. The corporal would, just as the sergeant, be answerable for the appearance and good behavior of the men in his immediate squad of inspection. He would inspect their arms and uniform before they go on parade or other duty, and make sure that they were properly equipped. In so doing, he would also keep a variety of tools for maintaining that equipment, such as a worm, a special tool that's screwed onto the end of an iron ramrod to clean out a musket barrel, as well as a leather punch, a brush for cleaning wool uniforms, and presumably a musket tool, although Symes doesn't specifically mention that one. He would also make sure that no man would be posted sentry who was the least in liquor, and should a soldier go to the infirmary or be otherwise indisposed, he would be the one to look after his arms and accoutrements, necessaries, and filling out a return with the sergeant on duty at the infirmary for all such items. Then, when the man is dismissed from the infirmary, he'd make sure that the man was following through with any and all directions from the surgeon, which might include taking his medicine. The more and more that you read about these lower level of NCOs, it basically feels like they are just glorified babysitters for the private soldiers. If anyone's a current service member and they are an NCO, that might prove true even today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But whenever men would be, for example, sent out on common fatigue duty, well then a corporal is the lowest rank that could accompany and oversee the men on such fatigue, should an NCO be deemed necessary. And whenever a new recruit would come in, well, sometimes a corporal would give them their most introductory drills, you know, how to stand under arms, how to march, and handle their firelocks individually, before learning more complicated drills with the other men, typically under a sergeant. During combat, then, the corporals would be all dispersed amidst the rank of their subdivisions to continue looking after the men and ensure that they're understanding the commands being issued to them and effectively executing them. They would, however, unlike the sergeants, typically be firing their actual, firelocks at the same musket as all the rest of the men, typically alongside the others. They're not going to be commanding anyone directly unless the situation is like really, really dire and there are no other junior officers or sergeants to be doing so. And that's really more or less all that Symes has to say about corporals, while Cuthbertson doesn't say very much at all that isn't under the purview of his wider section on qualifications for all NCOs. They are, after all, again, the lowest rank of NCO, and they don't have too much responsibility beyond the immediate care, being the first point of contact, for the handful of men that are directly under their supervision within their squad of inspection. For the most part, everything that the corporals are doing, the sergeants are doing as well, because they would typically also have a squad of inspection to maintain. The duty most specific to corporals, then, would be the inspection, posting, and relief of the sentries. That's by far the most commonly repeated role that I've seen in researching for this video, and of course it was a massively important one as well. Nor was it easy, given how many sentries and outposts an army camp might have at any given time, to make sure that all those men are being posted and relieved on the right schedule, and to regularly check up on them all, ensuring that they are staying alert. So now, with that, let's move on to our third section about sergeants, and here's where things get much more involved and role-specific. Once more pulling from the military dictionary, they are defined as being an officer without commission in a company of foot, sometimes commanding small detachments, and among other things, it is his particular duty to see the men keep their due distances, as in ensuring that on the march they are keeping their files and their ranks well, not spreading too far apart or losing their unit cohesion, for which purpose they would be posted on each flank of the unit, as well as another in the rear as a kind of supernumerary to look over the whole. The sergeants would also keep a full account of where all the men in the company are being housed, whether it's on garrison or on campaign, and to make regular rounds to check in on them all, make sure that they're behaving. Alongside many of the same obligations as corporals then, in keeping after the men in their squad of inspection, sergeants would also have a variety of larger tasks, particularly in administration. Why was it so important that sergeants be able to read, write, and do maths? Well, because to them, alongside the regimental adjutant, would fall one of the most important duties of all: keeping the regimental books. Quite literally, the accounting system for a regiment. When and how much the men are being paid, handling the stoppages of their wages for their uniform, their equipment, even their medical care. Tracking the money that's owed to the regimental tailor or to the cobbler, how much the laundresses are charging to clean the linen. They're handling the purchasing of that linen alongside other regularly necessary items to keep the men fit. The sergeants are ensuring that all of the accounts are balancing out properly and that no soldier is long in debt to his regiment or his officers, and of course as well making sure that no one is skimming anything off the top. The extent to which regimental life was dictated by finances, accounting, keeping track of the flow of money was immense. And that might surprise some people who are new to learning about this time period. It is crazy, though, just how much of Cuthbertson's book is dedicated specifically to the handling and tracking of money, in which the sergeants have an extraordinary amount of responsibility. I mean, his book is literally called The Interior Economy for a reason. It's not just the housekeeping, in more theoretical terms, of a regiment, right? I don't have time to spell out all of the details of where sergeants are always being posted and assigned on different jobs to keep track of all this stuff and make returns and accounts for every item within the regiment. But if any of that stuff interests you, well, like I said, the book is up as a free PDF at nativeoak.org. But suffice to say that for Symes' descriptions of the specific qualifications for a sergeant, well, alongside all the usual sober, disciplined, skilled at the exercise, he also includes that the candidate be honest and literally a competent, which is just an old way of saying a good accountant. The sergeants are also handling a lot of the regimental returns, being the reports on the state of the regiment's equipment and their men, alongside working rotas to ensure that all the different men are getting fair fatigue duties and that it's all being spaced out in such a way that won't wear out some bodies of men and keep others overly fresh and idle and whatnot, as well as all sorts of other paperwork. At least somewhat more exciting then than just endless mountains of paperwork, which is really the fate of a sergeant. They would also be responsible for handling all of their company's ammunition, making sure that it's kept secure and in good condition, and properly issued out to the men whenever necessary. Alongside the direct concerns of their specific squad of inspection, they're also handling the wider discipline of the entire company. The sergeants are meant to watch out for any drinking, gambling, or swearing, and to punish it swiftly. Symes writes that a proper sergeant ought to be feared by the bad and be beloved by the good. And in pursuit of this perfect godly discipline, the corporals are there to assist them, as they are to assist them in all of their roles, basically. The corporal is the assistant to the sergeant within this day-to-day management of all the little micromanaging affairs of the company. In combat, like we saw before, the sergeant is responsible for ensuring the men are keeping their proper place in the line, as well as understanding the orders of their officers, and again, enacting them properly. And they would be posted both on the flanks and in the rear for that purpose. Unlike the corporals, however, they would not typically be firing with a plain old musket alongside all the rest of the men, but instead would specifically be observing the men. They're keeping track of what's happening inside the formation so that officers can keep track of the wider situation without. In fact, sergeants wouldn't typically be carrying firelocks for that reason, but polearms like halberts or pikes, both as status symbols and practical tools on which their men could dress. I mean, you could literally use a polearm to force men into exactly the line that you want. And I have an entire video on that topic as well, which I'll link below. Conflicts like the American War of Independence, then, are a rare exception where most of the sergeants are abandoning their halberts pretty early on, although even still, as they took up firelocks like, common, dirty privates and corporals, they typically wouldn't be firing them unless something had gone, quite wrong for them. Rather, they're just using it as a way to blend in with the men that they're otherwise just directing. And lastly, while, contrary to popular belief, it was entirely possible for a sergeant to eventually become an officer, it wasn't all too common, and upon reaching this more or less senior-most enlisted rank, the sergeants would remain there for the duration of their careers, taking on more and more of their company's and the regiment's administrative responsibilities as they did so. In fact, I understand it's still a pretty proud tradition amongst the NCOs of the British Army that whenever a fresh-faced junior officer first joins his unit, well, he learns a lot about how the job is actually done, not only by the officers above him, but from the grizzled old veteran sergeants who had been soldiering since before the little ensign was even born. And if there are any, again, current or ex-service members who can comment on that dynamic personally, British Army or otherwise, I'd love to hear the stories that I know you all have. I'm always reminded on this topic of one amazing video, which I'll link down below, where some Scots Guards are on parade when the officer gives an order that the men can't actually do, upon which the officer is gently, respectfully, and swiftly corrected on the error by the Sergeant Major.
We'll move to the left in common groups. All they want, sir.
Again, the officer is technically in charge, but sometimes it's better to defer that authority. There can be flexibility in the chain of command where necessary, and nowhere is that more clearly and effectively the case than between the Sergeant Major and the junior officers. And this brings us to our final topic of discussion. The Sergeant Major is the sergeant's sergeant, typically the most senior of them, and the single most important NCO of them all, at least during this time period. Modern things get wonky. There's like, regimental sergeant major, garrison sergeant major, army sergeant major, just sergeant major back in the day. In fact, he's so important that he's very close in his own right to being an officer himself. He usually gets a much fancier uniform, a finer quality. He gets better lodgings, and again is meant to be separate from basically everyone in the regiment, even the other sergeants. It's a lonely life. Now, like I said, though, for most of the 18th century, this wasn't actually a formal position. It only became so in the 1790s, But still, we have references to this post in those earlier years and how immensely important it was, despite the fact that it wasn't like on the books. It's being acknowledged, of course, in Symes and in Cuthbertson both. While the latter describes the requirements for NCOs in a more generalized way, he has an entire massive chapter dedicated specifically to the sergeant majors, first specifying that the selection of them must never be influenced by any other consideration than that of real merit, and that he be a full sergeant of significant experience, a man who is sensible, sedate, and above conniving at the least irregularities, a sergeant, in short, who might expect complete and implicit obedience. Again, alongside all the usual make sure he's sober, good at numbers and all that, one line that really strikes me is that he must be able to bear with patience the stupidity of recruits and often of the other soldiers. And had the culture of the time allowed for it, something tells me Cuthbertson would have written, and the officers as well, at the end of that. He does, for example, specify that the officers have a duty to treat the sergeant major with the utmost respect and even deferment in some regards, as he is of such a great importance to the regiment. While other NCOs would get a probationary period of probably around 3 months, Cuthbertson suggests that the sergeant major get 6 months because of how important the post is. Symes, as well, specifies that he ought not just to have experience, but be possessed of many accomplishments, that alongside his technical duties, he might well serve to sometimes dissipate the men's fears and rouse their courage. He should be a man of real merit, a complete sergeant, and a good scholar and sensible in conversation, alongside being a genius for discipline, ready at his pen, and expert in making out returns, details, rosters, etc., right alongside telling off the regiment into files, platoons, divisions, or any other form required of them. Again, if you want to learn more about any of those terms, videos on combat organization listed below. But otherwise, I'm starting to repeat myself, I can tell. Point is, right, that despite not being an official title, the sergeant major was probably the single most important man in the actual day-to-day management and function of the regiments. After all, if the corporals and above them the sergeants are the one handling all that minutia, the sergeant major is the one who is looking after and directing all of those men who are so doing, the senior-most sergeant, right? Most importantly, of course, I keep on saying most importantly, also important, he is where, again, the buck stops for the discipline and the moral stature of the men, for their proper appearance and for their drill, basically, ultimately, for their being good soldiers and for the regiment being well run. In a brief conclusion, then, we have the sergeant major, then the sergeants, and finally the corporals. Sergeant major handles the whole regiment and is in direct, regular communication with the adjutant, while the sergeants are handling affairs within their individual companies and reporting back to the sergeant major with all of their returns and reports and filing, all the boatloads of paperwork. And then the corporals below them assisting the sergeants in all the same, with a particular emphasis on posting and maintaining the sentries. And of course, alongside all the paperwork, every NCO, except for the sergeant major, is directly responsible for a single squad of inspection, making sure that they are well turned out. But here's the thing, right, is I know that this was a longer video, kind of rambling, a lot of different responsibilities, a lot of information to cover, but all the same, right, this was barely scratching the surface of these respective positions. There is so much more information just in those 2 main books that I cited alone, let alone when you get into other books, like Earl of Cavan's A New System of Discipline, or especially the parody book, Advice to the Officers of the British Army, which is basically just roasting every rank. It's amazing, and it's actually a really great counter to the likes of Cuthbertson, where we see the worst of what was really happening rather than the best of what ought to have been happening. I mean, the author of that one literally describes how, once you make sergeant, you're probably not going to get another promotion unless you have a really attractive wife or a sister or a daughter. So you can really just relax, not care so much about discipline like you had to when you were a corporal. And you are not only to entertain a hearty contempt for your officers, the parody says, but you must also take care to communicate it to the soldiers. The more you appear to despise your superiors, the greater respect, your inferiors will profess for you. For the hardcore nerds of this stuff like me, it's a really funny read. I would recommend it. And then, of course, alongside those sorts of books, there are the actual soldiers' memoirs where you can look to see, how actual people were recounting their real experiences, their real interactions with others in those positions. Point being, right, there's a lot of reading to be done out there. And as I always say, if any of it interests you, you can check out the digital library at nativeoak.org to get your start on that research. It's a totally free resource. I will use, of course, your visiting the website as an opportunity to advertise my for sale books, but all the same, the primary sources are free. So with that, thank you all for watching, and especially to this channel's supporters on Patreon, without whom I wouldn't be able to do any of my work. If you'd like to get these videos totally ad-free, you can check out the Patreon below. Of course, it goes a very long way, and it only costs $1 a month. And you also get a much bigger say in where the channel's 10% charity profit share ends up going for whatever that happens to be worth. Thank you again, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.